So a tiny bit about me. You can read the bio in the program, or you can look at websites or whatever. Just, I come from kind of the reason why I talk about intersections, because I come from these different intersections. I work in academia, I work in governments, I work in Indigenous communities, I am an Indigenous person. I have all of these different ways of understanding kind of coming together. And so when people think about intersections, you often think of one or two things kind of coming together, but for me, the intersections look much more like this. They're complex, and for any of you who are working, and all of you in REBs and administrative roles, if you're working with community-based research, specifically in Indigenous context, you probably feel like you also are working in these intersections and really have no understanding of how to work through some of these new challenges that are being posed with the changes in policy and governance structures within our communities. So the context then for what I'll talk about today, first of all, as an Indigenous person who also is an academic, who also does this kind of work for a living, we often feel very precarious in between these different worldviews. In academia, we certainly don't fit 100% of the time because we have this different kind of community way of understanding. And then in our communities, we often also feel that same tension of not quite fitting there anymore. So when you're working with Indigenous communities or researchers who are engaged in Indigenous work, it's important to recognize that even just on a personal level, that conflict or that tension of the intersection can actually be quite profound. And one of the bases for all of the work that happens in Indigenous communities that is so different from most other academic research is this idea that all of our relations are all of our research. It's all connected. And so while, of course, a research project has to be specific in that it has a question that you answer and you can't possibly look at every single other variable in the world, it's important for us all to recognize that if we're working with Indigenous people, that's how we think. That's how we operate. It's not separate. The animals, the plants, as we heard at the beginning, it's all connected. So for us to artificially compartmentalize those pieces to do a research project and then I wonder why no one wants to participate. I wonder why I didn't get the things I wanted. It's because we're looking at it from such a narrow focus. And so one of the ways then that we're trying to kind of tackle that challenge is with this concept of two-eyed seeing. And folks here in Atlantic Canada probably may have heard of Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, who works at Cape Breton University to really bring science and traditional knowledge together in this way. So on the one side, we have what we're used to in universities, right? It's very individual, it's egocentric, it's based on competition, and it's very theoretical and understanding things from that perspective. And that's important and it's necessary, but it's not the only side. So then on the other side, we have Indigenous perspectives, multiple perspectives that are different. They're collaborative, they're collective, they're about what we're doing together versus what we're doing individually. And so it's then the bringing together of both of those worlds. It's not to say that one is better or worse than the other. We all have amazing gifts to offer to each other, and learning how to bridge those gaps between Indigenous ways of knowing and non-Indigenous ways of knowing is one of the ways in which we're able to actually then have successful research projects, successful programs, successful education, successful health, or whatever the area is we work in. So here in Canada, of course, we know we have lots of national structures that exist when it comes to law and governance and the ways in which things operate. And then every province has its own also governance structure. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, where a lot of my work around ethics specifically has been happening, is in Labrador, which, though it's not its own province as such, it certainly operates differently in a lot of ways than the rest of the province. So what we see here then are all of these policies that are based on geographical belonging. We all have them. We all have to subscribe to them. They exist within our laws, within our ethics, within all of those things. But then where things get more interesting to me is when we bring in the people. And just for simplicity's sake, I don't like to categorize folks, but I'm going to do it just for simplicity's sake, of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And then within the umbrella of Indigenous, there are many, and even these three are still just overarching categories, if you will, of Indigenous people. There are hundreds of different nations across Canada. And so in this context, we start seeing that our policies are based on ethnic or cultural belonging. So that's different than how the policies are enacted in this national way. So what happens in this space between the two? That's the kind of place that I've been working in for the last 12 years or so, of trying to understand what happens when we're coming together. In the 70s, Roger Poole talked about it as ethical space. And a Cree scholar, Willie Ermine, took that concept and kind of made it to be more applicable to Indigenous people. And so he's been working for about 20 years now in that same area of trying to understand how do we work here in this space between the two different worldviews. And so you might wonder, what does all this really have to do then with research ethics specifically? And it really is about Indigenous people's right to self-determination. And this crosses all boards. This is finally now becoming part of our everyday vernacular. People are hearing this language. People are starting to say it. And in that declaration, the United Nations has a Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I encourage, if you haven't heard of it before, to at least take a look at what that means. This is a global declaration that talks about the rights that Indigenous people have around the world. And of course, this one specifically is around self-determination. And that self-determination has to include research. It has to include what's being done in our communities, what information is being extracted from our communities, what benefits are coming back, if any, to our communities. Why are researchers, or why are communities saying no to researchers when the researcher offers nothing back? There's all these places that we're trying to work through to kind of understand that perspective. And so the UN Declaration was adopted in 2007. But at that time, it was rejected by 4 major players in the world: New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the US. And it was actually that in May of this year, so almost a decade later, that Canada has adopted the UN Declaration. But as tends to happen often, it was only about 6 weeks after that our Justice Minister told us it wasn't workable within the Canadian context, within our current legal system. And so still again, right, we're seeing this idea that we may say one thing, but then what we're doing doesn't always match what we're saying. So just to kind of rewind then for just a moment, back to 1996, we were also hearing a lot of this same language. When we heard about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, it was many years, many resources, many people, a lot of energy went into creating this commission. And they talked about then, 20 years ago, this renewed relationship with Indigenous people in 1996, based on this kind of cycle of understanding and respect and working with our communities. It was also in that same year, in 1996, that the last residential school closed. But yet it wasn't until 12 years later, in 2008, when we finally heard an official apology from the federal government for what happened during that time. And again, this is another one of those areas that even if your area of expertise is not in Indigenous research, I think we all have a responsibility to, at the very least, understand the context in which we're working. In Canada, we all have that responsibility. And so the apology talked about having to apologize for trying to kill the Indian in the child, which is what was happening for over 100 years when we were sending Indigenous children off to these residential schools. And so when the Truth and Reconciliation report was released a couple of years ago, we were seeing all sorts of statistics coming out, like this one, where Indigenous children were more likely to die in the residential school than soldiers were in the Second World War. And so from the Truth and Reconciliation, which obviously this slide itself, just the TRC, can be a whole talk, so I can't get into a lot of the detail other than to say it has calls to actions for all Canadians. They're calls to action, not recommendations, not things you should think about, not things that you might want to talk about over dinner. Calls to action, actual things for you to do, for every single Canadian to do. And they're in all of the different areas, in health and in education and youth and missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so of course in this context then, our focus is on the education system. Research is such a vital piece of education. We're teaching students how to do research. We're teaching each other. We're collaborating on projects. The way education had happened for so long was that while Indigenous children were put in schools and being told they were heathens and savages and not able to function in society, non-Indigenous students were also being told exactly that same thing in mainstream and public schools. So we have a lot of on-learning to do, a lot of relearning to do, based on just this one area of legislation and policy in Canada. So clearly with all of that, the time for action is now, right? We're all really sick of just talking about it. Let's do something about it. And recently I saw a great tweet on Twitter talking about how, of course, in the early 90s that the RCAP was going to be a game changer, and then the Truth and Reconciliation would be a game changer. And now currently we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women will be a game changer. But nothing has ever changed yet, right? We enact all of these policies. So we have a really great way of talking one way and walking a different way. And so instead of it being this idea of saying things to appease or to do what you think is right for a community, and then walking the other way, we're really trying to figure out how we can walk our talk. How can we enact the policies from the TCPS, from all of these other guidance documents that exist? How can we actually do the things that we're saying we need to do? And so then in this context, specifically around research ethics then, of course, as you all know, the history of the TCPS and starting in 1998 and coming through, what you may not know are some of the other Indigenous specific research ethics documents and guidance that have come out. Some of the major ones I'll talk a bit about is OCAP, which is Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. Just for curiosity, who's heard of that before? Next time, all the hands go up. Perfect. So a couple other things that happen, as you will all know with working with the TCPS, the CIHR guidelines for Aboriginal health research also really helped kind of formulate the basis for how we're engaging in this kind of work. It didn't last long as a standalone document because within like 6 months of the CIHR guidelines coming out, we had the new TCPS. But still, many communities use the CIHR guidelines. Many people prefer the language, the way that it was written versus the TCPS. And they use kind of bits like the two-eyed seeing part of taking the best bits of the multiple worlds. Same kind of idea when communities are developing their own research governance structures. They're not reinventing wheels. We all have a habit of doing that all the time, kind of starting over from nothing, but it exists already. So people are pulling from all of these documents. And I kind of came in on the scene around the time when the draft CIHR guidelines were happening. And so I've been kind of fortunate to kind of see all of this unravel over the last several years and how it's working and not working yet in our communities. So with the TCPS, as we know, the focus is very much on the individual, right? This is what ethics is all about. It's about our how we work and protect individuals within research based on the same four foundations that all research ethics is based on. When we look then, though, in Indigenous context, and certainly OCAP is not the only one, but this is kind of a big national in scope, the change then shifts from to now also focused on collectives. So of course individuals are still important. You need individual consent. You have to think about all the different implications for individuals. But in addition to that, you also have to consider the implications for communities and collectives. And so in that then, it's much more of a principle-based approach. And I know a lot of people hate that. They just want like an answer. Like, will you just tell me what to do? It's just like if A, then B. There isn't one. It's very principle-based. It's how we work in our communities. And so they're based then on these ideas of respect and relevance and reciprocity and responsibility. And these are for both sides, for all sides. The responsibility is not only on the Indigenous community or person, or only on the REB, or only on the researcher. It's how we're all kind of figuring this out together. So OCAP then kind of came from three big movements. The first being, a history of research with Indigenous people, which I'll give you kind of a very Coles Notes version of in a second. And then also, there was an increase, of course, in our own capacities in our community and our own interest in understanding the value of research and the role that we play in it. And then at the core of most of the movements in Indigenous contexts, it's about self-determination and self-governance, sovereignty, the right to control and to govern our own people and our own lands. That's kind of fundamental to all of those pieces. And while many people think of OCAP and other Indigenous things to be a roadblock, and while I see that on paper it certainly can be, and the way that we're currently trying to enact these different policies can be very challenging, but that's not what the point of these kind of policies and guidance documents are. One thing it's meant to do is to weed out those projects that really have no benefit to communities. A project cannot only be done for a person to get a degree or to get a publication or to get a promotion. There has to be something reciprocal in that. It might not look like some $1 million program. It doesn't have to be that. Are you building some capacity? Whatever you're extracting from a community, you should give back at least that much. More is preferable, but at least as much as you take. And that's also with people's knowledge. We can't just expect to take all of the knowledge and then never give anything back to people. And then most importantly with OCAP and most Indigenous ethics protocols is about building relationships. This is the foundation of all of it. It's relational, just like I said at the beginning. The relationship we have with the natural world, with the spiritual world, with future and past generations, this is also true in research. We have to build them together. Time is gone where you can just come and do 4 months in a community and then be done with it. People will say no to you, and they have a right to say no to you. And they will say no. Many communities now understand their position and their responsibility to their communities and will say no to researchers and REBs, even if it's approved by the REB. it doesn't necessarily mean it will be approved in a community. So just to think then about a couple of the ways this is happening around Canada, if we look in Ontario, the Manitoulin Islands has guidelines for Aboriginal research, and they focus on things like community empowerment and respectful relationships. Move over a little bit further to Quebec. This is one of the very first codes of ethics that came out in Ganawagi. And again, same kind of language, self-determination, empowerment, and responsibility. In Manitoba, they have a very complex yet simple kind of way of enacting OCAP in practice with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, with the various levels of players who are involved. So of course we have governments and funders and researchers and students and community members and participants. We all have different roles and responsibilities in that process. So how then can we figure out how to negotiate it? And you'll see often in Indigenous contexts, it's this kind of idea. It's not a linear process. And I know that drives you crazy with all your forms and the check boxes and it all just needs to be pretty, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's complex, sometimes it's messy, and we just need to start being okay with being uncomfortable in those settings. So then bringing us back here to Atlantic Canada, there's also many amazing things happening in communities here. I won't mention all of them because there's many more than I'll talk about, but just a couple to give you a sense. In Prince Edward Island, both of the major Indigenous organizations, the Mi'kmaq Confederacy of PEI, as well as the Native Council of PEI, both have their own research ethics review structure. And it's important we have then a responsibility as academics and REBs to learn what that is, to have meetings with them, to figure out who do we send researchers to. If a researcher comes to us and they're doing it with Charlottetown, that's different than if they're doing it on reserve. So who do I get to go to get that kind of approval? In Labrador, two major contributors to the ethics discussion have been the NunatuKavut, which is part of my community, and then the NunatuKavut government. They are an Inuit land claim, so they have full jurisdiction, the same as a province would, so they can always supersede anything that the province says. They have the authority to do that. Their research governance structure is very robust, and they are very okay with saying no. It's very awesome, actually, to watch people who think that they can do it the old way, who they'll just write it all up and then think, oh, well, it sounds great. Of course they'll say yes. And then they say no. And so it's important to kind of encourage people to be able to have that. And in Nova Scotia, at Cape Breton University, they also have a Native Ethics and Principle watch, and there's lots of people are involved in that. More regionally, for Mi'kmaq people in Atlantic Canada, there's a Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch, which is a kind of an additional layer of some of that. And also here in New Brunswick, there's a protocol for traditional knowledge with working with Maliseet folks. And also something that happened here in New Brunswick just a couple of years ago, I'm sure many of you, or all of you probably know Will Vandenhoenaard. He hosted a conference, I think it was in 2012, that we were here at UNB called the Ethics Rupture. And then from that, it was a very small group of, I think 30 or 40 of us from a few different countries, mostly Canadian, but like some New Zealand and Brazil and a couple others were here. And essentially, the whole conference was about alternatives to biomedical research review, because we recognize, right, that biomedical model doesn't fit in education and social work and social science and all these other pieces. So it very much then was this idea of creating a declaration of how can all of these different types of researchers come together to challenge the model that exists and to provide ways that we can move forward in a way that's meaningful to our participants. So if we look back then to this kind of timeline of when all the TCPS and all this stuff came out, what ends up happening is that you have this many processes. So this is the amount of policy and process that I had to go through for a research project. It took forever to get approved, right? I mean, this is not as simple as just going and getting that one approval. Even if you're working across jurisdictions in universities, if you get one university approval, most others will kind of approve it at a much faster rate because you've already been approved somewhere else. It's different though when we're looking at communities because they're not looking for the same thing. So while the university approved it because it checks all your boxes of what's ethical and what's okay, it might not be what's ethical and okay in the community. So we end up having desks that look kind of like this, and we feel like every which way is the wrong way because every time we try, it's for sure stop sign and we can't do it. And people get so frustrated. I hear it all the time. Well, why is it so complicated? Why can't it just be a simple process? Why can't I just do A, B, and C and then do it? Like I said, there is no easy answer, and it will be different in every community. Even within the same community, it might be different the next time. I've worked in some communities for 15 years, and every time we do a project, maybe it's different people, maybe it's a different priority. something will be different. There isn't cookie cutter approaches. There isn't a template where you can just fill in the blanks and it all works that way. It takes more time, it takes more effort. But like all the things that take more time and effort, it also brings more reward and more success and more of all the things that you want to do in your projects and in your administration. So what we kind of propose then is an REB GPS. And in this context, the GPS is guiding principles and strategies. Again, no prescription. There will not be a very easy way of sorting through it. Unfortunately, Garmin doesn't make a moral GPS where we can just kind of punch in what we think about doing and see if it will tell us the right way. So instead, we're left with the old-fashioned moral compass. What's right? What's wrong? And what's been interesting for me, I only speak English. I'm missing the part of the brain for language, so as much as I love it and listen to others, I don't speak other languages. But in most of our Indigenous language, there is no word for ethics, there is no word for research. These are constructs that we have now that we try to fit in. But the best way to understand ethics is to do the right thing and to be true to yourself. To do the right thing and to be true to yourself. Do you think that students and researchers are always doing those two things when all they care about is that ethics is a step that they just got to get over? They don't then think about ethics after that. They get their approval, then they're done. So how do we make this a more personal, a way that people are more relational in the work that they're doing? So these principles then are based on those 4 R's I talked about earlier. This is used in First Nations education. It's used in First Nations health, in program development. It started in British Columbia and it's kind of worked its way all across. Respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And of course, all of those would not be possible without the relationship piece. The relationships are the fundamental part that will make a difference in the project being successful, whatever that success looks like. And they're very much the building blocks then of what we're doing. So if we have all of this, we're going to make the mistakes, we're going to have messy situations, but learning how to come at it from this very relational piece is really important. So why then do we even need that GPS? I know most of you as administrators and REB folks probably feel like there's this huge maze between you and Indigenous communities and how to navigate this system when you have policies coming from every which direction and communities saying one thing. Of course, we then have big P and small p politics and all of the pieces that fit together to make it a very complex puzzle. Just to give a visualization of what that kind of looks like, this is just in Labrador, just for governance for Indigenous things. Look at all the different circles, look at all the different layers. We're all connected, yet we're all separate. We all have different pieces. So this is just Labrador. Imagine what this looks like for Atlantic Canada, all of Canada, all of Turtle Island, North America. Imagine what that looks like when we're including multi-sites, how complex that structure looks. Then, of course, one of the biggest issues that continues, and hope it's not as bad, but it still happens more than it ought to in 2016, that Indigenous people are still exoticized and romanticized. And how can we just need to figure out how they're doing that. What are they doing? They, othering, making it as if not the same, not human. They're somehow different than us. I chair the Native Council of PEI's board right now, and someone actually called us on the phone, and when I asked her why she was interested in working with this community that she'd never been to, never seen before, never heard of it. She's like, well, I'm in the UK and I was looking at a map of Canada and saw this really cool island and I thought if there's Native people there, then they would be the best people to study. And that was her reason. Even if that is your reason, you should never say that. That's not the right answer. That's not the right answer. And so this still happens. This still happens today where researchers get an idea that something looks fun or exciting or different, and we'll go study them. We'll go figure out them, something different. Dissemination of research and results. This is a huge problem that continues to happen. Tons of researchers now are finally getting it, that we need to spend the time and effort and money up front in building relationships and doing that kind of stuff in a good way. But what they forget then is that it doesn't just end there. It doesn't just end when you get the approval. Once you're finished your project, hopefully you've done it in a way that have included the community the whole way. They should be on board as collaborators, helping you analyze things, giving you context that you don't know. We don't know. Living in these communities, and we go up north, we have no idea what the context there is. They know that. They're the experts. We can't come back with all of our fancy charts and things that we get excited about and check boxes, because it does not excite people in our communities. They don't care. They want it to be practical and have value in their work and in their life. And if they've spent the last several months working with you as a research facilitator, as the person who does everything for you in the community, the very least you can do is then come back and share with them in a way that's meaningful to the community. Same is true, of course, of data ownership. We say that you can access your data, but come on, we all know also how much red tape and everything else is required for a person to access anything once it's done. And then the REB, of course, will have their little checkbox of in X amount of years it will all be destroyed. Well, what if we want it 10 years after that? Then what happens? This one is my favorite. Hearing about Indigenous people by non-Indigenous people all of the time. And this also still happens. And there's no reason for this to still happen because there are many Indigenous people who have skills, knowledge, expertise, education, all the things, and they're able to say this for ourselves. Yet, more often than not, any kind of gathering I attend, there will be at least one person who's non-Indigenous, has no connection to a community, who's never even talked to an Indigenous person, who's up there telling us all about ourselves. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, and what I want to drive home for people is this idea of relational research and that it's all connected. And so one of my favorite Indigenous scholars, Jeff Redding, he said once, we want to be at the table, not just on the menu. And I think that this fits everywhere, because especially now in the last couple of years, everywhere is talking about Indigenous people and reconciliation and what can we do? Have us here at the table, not just like, oh yeah, we should talk about the Indians. Well, that's not really helpful to not actually then have us at the table to talk about those things. So we're trying then to figure out how we get through this maze that's a bit complex. So many of you, obviously you all know about the TCPS, and we're going to talk specifically about Chapter 9. Won't get into all of the details, there's certainly not time for that. But I just want to kind of draw your attention to this idea that we have this, right? The policies, the procedures, it's all there, but we don't know what to do with it. Nobody knows what to do with it. Everybody I talk to, regardless of where they fit on the research spectrum, we don't know what to do with it because we're not doing this iteration that we need to. The projects that I've been working in that have been the most successful thus far, and by successful I mean by everybody's standards, not just by the person who got the most publications from it, is when we're learning from what we're doing. So we have the theory, we have the policy, we have all that stuff, but then we're doing it. And we're making mistakes, and we're screwing things up big time, and then we figure it out and do it again. And it's back and forth, it's back and forth. It's not a linear process. So in the TCPS, 5 of the national Indigenous organizations were involved to some extent in creating that part of the policy. And you can find out more about all of these. And I encourage you to, even if your expertise or your area is not Indigenous research, that doesn't mean you can't learn a bit about this, especially if you are REB members and administrators, because some of your students and professors and researchers will be doing this work. And they look to you for guidance in how to do it. So we all need to figure out kind of how to make that work. So in Chapter 9 then, the underlying questions, first of all, how can research even proceed responsibly against kind of this backdrop that we have of how research has been conducted here for so long up to this point? At what point does the paradigm of individual consent break down, and why? And then finally, what is the role of community involvement in research? And so these kind of 3 pieces then we're looking at is the self-determination, which is always kind of core to the Indigenous communities, how that works within research, and how we're doing it in that relational way. So we're doing okay with having this talk, right? We can see the different things, but what we're missing is the pieces between them. And I think that's this audience, you guys have such an important role to play in helping be the connecting dots between those different pieces. And so even within the TCPS, it's recognized that in Indigenous context, our research is embedded within relationships.